Today on the Hidden Book Nook, we're looking at a book with a title that definitely isn't trying to be subtle. The Bold Act of Giving by Michael Camelio is a book about caring, but more specifically, it's about what happens when we begin treating detachment, indifference, and emotional distance as signs of strength. Camelio's argument is essentially this. Maybe the problem isn't that we care too much. Maybe we become afraid of caring deeply because caring makes us vulnerable. This is part self-help, part cultural critique, part personal reflection, and unexpectedly, part fiction. And while the title might make you expect something intentionally provocative or even cynical, I actually found the heart of this book to be quite the opposite. This is a deeply earnest book. It's about trying when failure is possible, loving when loss is inevitable, learning from pain rather than worshiping it, and allowing yourself to care even when caring costs you something. So let's get into the bold act of giving a fuck. The book begins as a direct response to a cultural philosophy that Michael Camelio believes has become too comfortable with detachment. Importantly, Camelio is careful not to argue that Mark Manson literally told readers to care about nothing. He acknowledges that the deeper message behind the subtle art of not giving a fuck is about choosing what deserves your attention and caring about the right things. Camelio's disagreement is with what he sees as the cultural effect of the language surrounding that philosophy. His concern is that somewhere along the way, selective caring became associated with emotional detachment. Not caring began to look cool, cynicism began to look mature, and emotional distance began to look like strength. Camelio wants to push in the opposite direction. His message is care, try, love people, risk disappointment, don't allow failure to become your identity, and don't confuse numbness with freedom. The first part of the book develops this argument across 10 major discussions involving subjects like trying, happiness, individuality, pain, failure, human connection, absurdity, morality, and the conscious decision to care. And what's interesting is that Camelio doesn't approach these ideas entirely from an academic distance. Much of his argument comes from his own experiences. The personal side of the book. This is where the book becomes considerably more personal. Camelio explains that his philosophy of caring wasn't developed simply by reading philosophy or self-help books. It was shaped by experiences in hospital rooms and by fighting for someone he loves. He describes watching his wife's health deteriorate after a cancer treatment damaged her heart, including an incident in which her heart stopped and she subsequently spent time on a ventilator. For Camelio, experiences like these fundamentally changed what the idea of caring too much meant. His conclusion is essentially that emotional detachment wouldn't have made these experiences painless. It would have only made him less emotionally present inside them. And that idea becomes one of the strongest threads running throughout the book. Caring does not protect us from pain, but refusing to care doesn't necessarily protect us either. That's an important distinction because Camelio isn't promising that caring makes life easier. In many ways, he argues the opposite. Caring can be exhausting. Trying can lead to rejection. Love creates the possibility of grief. Hope creates the possibility of disappointment. But his question is, what's the alternative? If we eliminate everything that can hurt us, how much of life do we eliminate with it? One of my favorite ideas in the book concerns failure. Camelio doesn't romanticize it. There's an entire chapter called Failure is Feedback, Not a Religion, and I think that title summarizes his perspective extremely well. We hear phrases like fail forward all the time. Failure gets presented as though simply experiencing it automatically makes us wiser. Camelio disagrees. Failure isn't automatically valuable. What matters is whether you actually examine what went wrong and use that information. He compares it to an engineer looking at a failed test. The engineer doesn't celebrate because the test failed. They examine the data, adjust something, and test again. In other words, don't worship failure. Learn from it. That connects nicely with another recurring idea in the book, the importance of trying. Camelio writes about his own professional projects and the experience of continuing to believe in something, even when the phone isn't ringing and the emails aren't coming. There's a line of thought here that I really liked. What trying actually costs us isn't simply effort. It costs hope, because hope requires continuing before you know whether you're going to receive anything in return. And I think that's one of the book's more insightful observations. Sometimes failure is easier than uncertainty. At least failure gives us an answer. Trying requires us to keep moving while we don't have one. Camelio also pushes back against the idea that suffering is automatically meaningful. In his chapter about pain, he makes an important distinction between pain that teaches you something and pain that you've simply normalized. Sometimes pain is information. Sometimes it's telling you something needs to change. And simply becoming better at tolerating something harmful isn't necessarily personal growth. The broader point is that caring requires participation. It requires us to notice what's happening in our lives rather than simply enduring it. That applies to our work, our relationships, our mistakes, and especially to other people. One of the exercises Camelio describes involves imagining, during an argument, that the person you're fighting with suddenly isn't there anymore. What if those angry words became the final words you ever said to them? It's uncomfortable, and that's the point. Camelio uses that thought experiment to force everyday conflict into a larger perspective. Because when we remember that our time with people is limited, suddenly winning every argument becomes considerably less important. Time to talk about Michael Camelio's writing style. Camelio writes in an extremely conversational voice. Reading the nonfiction portion often feels less like reading a traditional self-help book and more like sitting across from someone who's intensely explaining something they genuinely believe. The language is blunt. There is profanity throughout the book, which shouldn't be surprising considering the title, but most of the profanity doesn't feel like it's simply there for shock value. It contributes to the confrontational, conversational personality of the narration. Camelio also frequently uses short paragraphs and sentence fragments. He'll build an argument through several paragraphs and then suddenly reduce the entire idea to one short statement. This creates a punchy rhythm and gives certain lines extra weight. Another characteristic of his writing is repetition. Words and ideas like caring, trying, silence, pain, failure, and detachment return again and again. Sometimes that repetition functions almost like a refrain. Camelio is also comfortable admitting uncertainty. He doesn't present himself as a detached expert delivering universal instructions from above. In fact, the manuscript explicitly describes him as someone who is not a therapist, life coach, or motivational speaker, but someone whose experiences have given him strong opinions. And I think that distinction matters. This book isn't written like a clinical guide. It's an argument, it's personal, it's occasionally angry, sometimes funny, and frequently vulnerable. Then something fascinating happens in part 2. The writing changes. After spending the first part of the book arguing for the importance of caring, Camelio essentially says, "Now I'm going to show you what I mean." And the book becomes fiction. Part 2 is called A Love Rewritten. Camelio describes it as something more than a bonus story. It's intended to embody the ideas from the previous 10 chapters through fiction. Set in 2051, the story follows Jonah Hartley, an aging writer, living largely inside his memories and grief. Eventually, an artificial intelligence becomes part of Jonah's life. Without giving away everything that happens, the story explores the idea that Jonah's writing about someone he deeply loved helps teach future systems something about the emotional patterns of human love. It's a fascinating concept. The first part of the book asks, why should we care? The second part asks, what happens to the things we care about after they're gone? Stylistically, this section becomes much more literary. The sentences become much more atmospheric. Silence, snow, memory, rooms, physical objects, and small gestures take on symbolic importance. Camelio allows scenes to breathe more than he does in the argumentative chapters. And underneath the speculative fiction concept is a very human story about grief. It's about memory. It's about the strange ways love continues after someone is gone. And ultimately, it's about finding a way to keep living without pretending that loss has disappeared. The second half gives emotional form to the philosophical argument of the first. What I appreciated most about this book is its sincerity. There is very little emotional distance between the author and what he's writing. You may not agree with every argument he makes, and I don't think the book requires you to. In fact, disagreement is almost built into its structure. This is a counter-argument. It's supposed to start a conversation. But beneath all of the provocative language is a surprisingly simple idea. Your life matters because things matter to you. People matter. Trying matters. Learning matters. Love matters. And allowing yourself to genuinely care about those things isn't evidence that you're weak or naive. It's evidence that you're participating in your own life. I think this book will appeal to most readers who enjoy unconventional personal development books, philosophical self-help, memoir-style reflection, cultural criticism, and books that aren't afraid to challenge popular ideas. It may also appeal to readers who enjoy genre blending because the transition from nonfiction, cultural argument into speculative literary fiction is definitely unusual. But if you like authors with strong voices and very clear opinions, there's plenty here to engage with. Ultimately, the bold act of giving a fuck isn't really asking readers to care about everything. That's an important distinction. It's asking us to stop treating caring itself as the problem, to choose what matters, and then have the courage to actually care about it, even when caring makes us vulnerable, even when trying might end in failure, even when loving someone means knowing that someday we may have to grieve them. Because perhaps a meaningful life isn't created by successfully avoiding pain. Perhaps it's created by finding the people, ideas, dreams, and experiences that are worth risking pain for. And that is The Bold Act of Giving a Fuck by Michael Camelio. This book will be available to buy on September 1st. I was lucky to get an advanced reader copy. If you enjoy discovering independent and lesser-known books, subscribe to the Hidden Book Nook for more reviews. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.